I'm Thomas Rieger,
And I'm Phoebe Christopher.
and today we'll be bringing you the story of Jonathan Sharp. We read through all the files and transcripts related to this case, but we needed something else, so we interviewed John Sharp.
In December of 2012, Jonathan Sharp was arrested and charged for second-degree attempted murder, first-degree assault, assault with a deadly weapon, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment.
It was on December 17th, 2012, a few days before Christmas, when John and his ex-wife Jennifer were scheduled to meet at a parent coordinator's office. They were meeting to finalize a change in the agreement they had made earlier in that year.
The agreement stated that John would have the kids for 5 days during the holidays, including Christmas Day, because Jennifer had the kids for Thanksgiving. Jennifer would not sign off on the plan, so when they were trying to discuss this, they started arguing and things escalated quickly.
Keep in mind that they are arguing in the office of their parent coordinator. According to John, the mediator was taking Jennifer's side.
The thing that probably got me the angriest is the mediator really was kind of in on it. Like it almost seemed like her and my wife had kind of like talked about what they were going to say before, because she just wasn't going to do anything for me. It wasn't like, okay, well, let's do this Christmas and then we'll figure it out after Christmas. It was, well, if she doesn't sign it, then that's just it.
John wasn't gaining any ground.
And, I argued with her. I was like, look, if you can actually make a decision to let it just go for this Christmas. And she's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, well, that doesn't make sense. I said, she had Thanksgiving. Like, why can't I have Christmas? And she's like, you are getting Christmas. It's just less time. And I said, yeah, that's the problem. And so at that point, it kind of just got really amplified. And then, I just remember snapping.
John flew into a rage, and now this is where the facts get skewed. According to the state, he threw a dollhouse out of an unbreakable glass window, picked up a ceramic cat, threw Jennifer down on the couch, and began hitting her with the ceramic cat until she was unconscious. The state then proceeded to say that Jennifer had permanent brain damage from the assault and that her skull was fractured.
There was no actual proof that she suffered any brain damage or that her skull was fractured as a result of the attack. According to John, he didn't hit his ex-wife with the ceramic cat. Yes, it was found on the floor broken, but this isn't because he hit her with it, it's because it fell in the scuffle. If he had actually hit her with the full force of the ceramic cat, she'd likely be dead. In the interview, he said that he hit her 5 times with his fist, and as soon as she started bleeding, he stopped immediately.
I had punched her, I'll say, around 5 times in the face before she started bleeding, and that's what caused me to stop. She had a split lip, and her left eyebrow, I guess, took 7 stitches.
So yes, what he did was bad, but not as bad as the state said it was. So why were the state and Jennifer allowed to say those things and exaggerate what had happened?
So most of it was totally inaccurate, and the issue with that was we had just got, my lawyer had just looked at the medical report before we walked into court for the sentencing. So my lawyer had almost no clue what was in there. And of course she didn't have anyone with a medical background review it. My sister she has a doctorate in physical therapy. So she at least knows the anatomy, if not, general diagnoses. And the skull fracture was basically nonsense, because if you get in the medical report and dig down deep, the skull fracture was on her, what was it? It basically, it was on the back of her head. You know where you get that bump at the back of your skull? That's where her skull fracture was, but it was so small and insignificant that it couldn't be treated, and they weren't even sure it was a result of anything I did.
We were wondering why they were allowed to exaggerate the facts, so we asked John.
You can say almost anything you want in the sentencing phase. I mean, she used a lot of hearsay, and I mean, you're not tied to anything. Nobody's sworn in. One of my issues on post-conviction was that, my ex-wife was never sworn in when she gave her testimony. So if she's not sworn in, that means you can say whatever you want. Like, she could have said that I, beat her and raped her before I left the place, and they'd be like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, well, why not? You did everything else. And so it's just kind of ridiculous that they don't kind of keep them under control on that too. Like, there's all these rules of evidence and everything at the trial phase, but once you get to sentencing, you can say whatever you want.
John could have gone to trial and tried to defend himself against the second-degree attempted murder charges to try to get a lesser charge. But because he took the plea deal, there was no jury, no trial, and no one was sworn under oath.
So why would anyone take a plea deal in the first place? To answer this question, we turn to Serial Podcast's explanation in the 5th episode of Season 3.
Most states began revamping their sentencing guidelines and their criminal codes. A lot of crimes were being defined both more broadly and more specifically. Theft, fraud, burglary, robbery, assault, sexual assault, kidnapping, their definitions expanded, which made them harder to defend against. And they carried more serious penalties. Same with laws about guns, and especially about drugs. Expansive criminal codes allow prosecutors to expansively charge, because a single criminal act doesn't have to be singly charged. You can pile on as many charges as you want. Doesn't matter if they overlap, so long as each one requires you to prove something slightly different. That's how an armed robbery can end up charged as, say, 8 felonies that sound like echoes bouncing around a canyon. The result is a kind of indictment shock and awe. Charging like this, what's known as stacking charges or just overcharging, induces pleas. Of course it does. Because the prosecutor can accordion the indictment however he needs. If you plead, we'll drop everything but the felonious assault, or you go to trial on the full, formidable indictment. And chances are, if you go to trial, you're going to get convicted of something. Just the visual of a long indictment is a signal to the jury, look at this list. He must have done something. And while some charges probably are going to merge at sentencing, as a rule, the more stuff you're convicted of, the longer your sentence is going to be. So yeah, you plead.
Even though he took the plea deal for the lesser charge, he was sentenced to 15 years with all but 8 years removed. He ended up doing 5.5 years and got 1.5 years taken off of his sentence for good behavior.
He probably could have been sentenced to much less time if he hadn't pled and gone to trial instead to defend himself against the prosecutor's ridiculous claims.
But the fact of the matter is that he pled. What he did was bad, but did he deserve a 15-year sentence? Well, let's look at some other cases for reference.
A woman was sentenced only 18 months after drunkenly stabbing her husband. In another case, a man was sentenced only 7 years for human trafficking.
7 years?
In 2012, a woman was sentenced to only 10 years after fatally stabbing her husband with a knife.
John was sentenced 15 years for first-degree assault. That is 5 more years than the woman who stabbed her husband to death. In conclusion, John's story exemplifies how flawed our judicial system is, and that sentencing varies a lot depending on whether you take a plea deal or go to